Every family has at least one real character. In ours, it was always my Uncle Joe. Joe was a gambler. I mean, he absolutely loved gambling. Unfortunately, it didn't love him because that's ultimately how he met his demise. Now, Joe was a great guy. Everybody loved him. He was funny, quick with a compliment. He always remembered your name and your favorite whiskey. Unfortunately, he had one fault. He was a compulsive cheater, and by that I mean he really couldn't help himself but cheat. And that is what ultimately, finally, did him in.
It happened one night when Joe was playing a high-stakes game of poker with a group that wasn't his normal crowd, but they liked him all the same. They were playing five-card draw, and after several rounds of betting and raising, there was a lot of money on the table. They started showing their hands. There were some pretty good ones. Then it finally got to Joe, and they asked, "Joe, what you got?" Joe flipped over his cards and said, "Well, boys, got you all beat with 5 kings." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then one of the guys said, "Joe, come on, you can't have 5 kings. That's impossible. You'd have to be cheating." Joe sighed, put one of his cards down, said, "Fine." So they dealt again, finally got to Joe and asked, "Joe, what do you got?" Joe flipped his cards over and once again said, "5 kings, boys. Read 'em and weep." They all looked at each other, then at Joe, and one said, "Joe, what are you doing? You can't have 5 kings. Come on." So Joe said, "Fine." So they dealt another round. It gets to Joe. Joe turns over his cards and 5 kings. Well, this was getting ridiculous. His buddy looked right at him and said, "Joe, you cannot have 5 kings. There aren't 5 kings in the whole deck." Again, Joe said, "Fine," and they dealt another round. Gets to Joe. Everyone's looking at him. He turns over his cards, and sure enough, 5 kings again. His friend, completely exasperated, says, "Joe, this has to stop. You're clearly cheating. You must have 10 cards there." Joe said, "No, just these fives." "Well, Joe, you're obviously cheating, and though we like you, we just can't have that. We better not see the 5 kings again." Joe said, "Fine." Well, the next hand was the biggest of the night. The pot went up and up until everyone was all in. Everyone showed their cards until it finally came around to Joe. His buddy said, "Joe, it's time to see your hand, and it better not be 5 kings." Joe said, "Relax. This time I have the 5 aces." And that's when they shot him. As Joe took his last breath, his final word was, "Fine." The crazy part is that if Joe had just played the cards he'd been dealt, he really would have been fine. In fact, he would have walked away with the whole pot.